everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Kieseritzky Gambit in the King's Gambit accepted line. Want to thank our sponsor today from Skillshare. More from them later in the video. So the King's Gambit, my favorite opening in all of chess, starts out with e4, e5, f4, and then in the accepted line, pawn takes on f4, and then knight f3. Black has a lot of different options they can attack us from, but we're going to be looking at the move g5. g5 is usually met by h4. This is the most common way. And after pawn pushes to g4, this is where the gambit we're going to be looking at today gets into, and that is when the knight comes to e5. White also has the option of playing g5, but I think the e5 variation is much stronger. Now, the four lines that we're going to look at from black's standpoint, the first one is knight to f6. Then we're also going to look at d6, more of that Fischer attack, just playing d6, opening up for the light squared bishop here. We're also going to look at h5, protecting this g4 pawn that's now being attacked by the knight on e5. And then lastly, we're going to look at bishop to g7. The first variation we're going to look at is if they play knight to f6. One theme to always be thinking about when you play this is when the knight's on e5, we're attacking the f7 square, which is the weakest square for black early on because the king is the only piece that is defending it. So if they're not going to attack our knight on e5, we're going to be looking to play bishop c4. Getting more material into the game, attacking critical squares. Right now, f7 is our target. So the bishop and the knight are both attacking this square. Now, the most common move that they're going to play is d5, but they may not play this. And so in these openings, it's always good to understand what the approach is so that if they don't play the normal moves, which we'll go over d5 as well, that you understand what you're getting after. So let's say they play knight to c6. Okay, well, in this case, we're going to take with our bishop on f7. A lot of the King's Gambit, especially in the accepted lines, is to get a very, very strong attack. They can't take our bishop. It's protected by the knight here. So we're going to force them to e7. This is a terrible square for the king. You can see it's blocking both the queen and the bishop from coming to these central squares. But you can also see from here, the knight's attacking our knights. Now, we could just bring our bishop back, but I really like the move pawn d4. This is better than, I think, bishop to b3, because then they're going to take right here. We push up on d4. They can move their knight away. We can start to push a little bit forward, but I don't think that's nearly as good as just pushing up to d4. Now, if they were to take, I think it's really a mistake here, because let's say they take with their knights, then we're just going to take with their pawn. They're probably going to take our bishop now. So they take with their king, we take with their pawn, but then they take with their queen, and we can take with our bishop. Now, if you look at this and say, why the bishop? Can't they just take our bishop? Well, no, they really can't, because if they take with their queen, then we can play rook to f1, and we are pinning down their queen to the king. So that would be a huge blunder. They would lose their queen. I always like to put my opponent in a position where they can make a lot of mistakes. So yes, we can actually take this pawn back. And then if you look at the material here, both sides are even as far as the pawns, but you can see that the king is completely exposed, and we have a lot of strong attackers, and we can even bring our rook here to f1. We can potentially castle on the queen side, but maybe they don't take our queen or our bishop on f4, and they decide, oh, let's go ahead and blow up the queen side, and they attack on b2. Well, we have some pretty strong attacks here. First, with queen to d5. I think queen taking on b2 would be a huge mistake for them. Queen to d5 gets us on the attack here. King comes back to e8. We can castle on the king side here. And they have a couple options. If they were to play c6, attacking our queen, we'll kind of go through the threats here. Queen to h5, check. You can see this would be a disaster. King to d8. Now we play bishop e5. We're attacking the queen and the rook up here. Maybe queen to c2, gobbling up some material. But then we can play bishop to f6, check. They move their king. We now get our knight involved into the game. We have so many threats on the board. B6, now we take their rook here. So lots of ways for them to mess this up. If they decide instead, okay, C6 doesn't do a lot, well, let's get our queen involved into the action. Queen to B6, I think, is better after they take on B2. This is check, so we're going to have to play king H1. But then how do they really stop things? One move is queen to C5. Say, okay, yeah, if you're going to be attacking, I need to control this 5th rank right here, because we already saw that bad stuff happens if you play queen to H5. But now this is another spot where we can put this in a tough position. We can play the move bishop takes C7. Another pawn that we can capture with our bishop, and we're just baiting them to say, go ahead and take our bishop. It's a free piece. Go ahead and take it. Now, this would be a huge mistake, because if they do take it, now we have the move queen to F7. You can see after the king moves that we can play queen to F6, check, and then after the king comes back, we can take their rook on H8. So let's come back to the beginning after bishop to C4. That was if they played knight to C6 and just really ignore the F7 square. The most common play that they're going to make is D5. This opens up for their light square bishop to get involved into the action. It blocks the bishop right away and also opens up for their queen to defend this D5 square as well. When they do that, we're going to go and take with our pawn. That's pretty much always going to happen. And then they're usually going to play D6. Now, if they don't play D6, I think it is a big mistake for them. But getting this bishop attacking this knight is critical, as well as just opening up for black to castle on the king side if they want to, I think is the best approach. And also stopping this pawn from pushing forward. From blockading this pawn, it also stops the threat of the light square bishop attacking the F7 square. A lot of things that black really needs to do in this opening. Once they do that, we're going to be playing pawn to D4. Now, I do think if they castle on the king side, it's a mistake, because we can just take here on F4. So instead, I think they probably need to play knight to H5. This is defending the F4 square. Not the easiest move to always find, bringing your knight to the H file. Not super common, but if they do that, I think now castle on the king side, adding another attacker on the F4 square. Now, if they get pretty aggressive, they could play queen takes on H4. And this is, if I'm playing black, this is the path I like to play, because I think it's very aggressive and it's very difficult for white to get the upper hand. But in this case, I think white needs to be playing queen to E1 and just try to stop the attack from black. Now, it's not easy for black by any means. White still has the 2 central pawns, even though there are double pawns on the D file. Black has no central pawns. The king is completely exposed. Even if they castle on the king side, it's not a very safe king as well. And so there is a blockade in the middle with the knight on E5. So white still has a very, very strong game. By no means is black able to take advantage of this. But white does not have the upper hand as far as the attack. So just keep that in mind. That's what's going to happen early on if they play knight to F6. And then we bring our bishop to C4. Now a word from our sponsor, Skillshare. If you're not familiar with Skillshare, it's an online community where you can take classes on pretty much anything that you want. I just got through going through MKBHD's YouTube success class. Really good content. I'm just interested personally in other big channels and how they approach YouTube, how they get engagement, and have high quality content. So if you're interested in Skillshare, what's nice is they're giving the first 1,000 people to click the link below in the description as well as the pinned comment a free month. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely click below and let me know what you think. Coming back to the next variation is if black plays D6. I always like to also give my recommendation if you are facing this. If I'm playing black, I do like the D6 variation the most. I just think it really puts white on the defensive more than some of the other options. In this case, D6, reminder that if they're not attacking our knight, we're usually going to bring our bishop to C4. If they are attacking our knight, we're going to need to come back. Now, in this case, because they're attacking our knight and this pawn on G4 is not under attack, we're going to go ahead and bring our knight back to G4 and capture this material right here. If The problem is they have a very strong move with bishop to e7. Now the queen and the bishop are both attacking this pawn. At some point, we're going to need to come back to f2. It doesn't really matter if we do it on this next move or in 2 moves, because it's either going to be d4 and then knight to f2, or knight to f2 and then d4. Because the reason they play e7 is because they're going to capture on the next square. We're going to need to come to f2 at this point and stop it. And so that's why, it doesn't really matter if you play after bishop to e7. You could play pawn to d4 first, and then bishop, and then the knight comes back here. That's fine. Or you could just play after the bishop, you could play knight to f2, and then bishop to h4, and then d4. They're the exact same thing, but usually I like to just start with d4. Okay, so bishop takes h4, knight to f2, and then the bishop to g3. Now, the reason this is important is because they want to keep the pressure, pinning down the knight to the king, but they also want to make sure that we can't just take bishop on f4. Once we do that, we've really started to get a good structure on the king side of the board, but the bishop on g3 stops that. Okay, so we need to get other material involved into the game, especially adding more pressure on the f4 square. And we're going to start by playing queen f3. Now we have both our bishop on c1 and our queen attacking the pawn. Now, if they continue to add pressure, remember, they don't have to play the optimal moves. I'm kind of going over the best moves that they play and trying to teach you the themes that you should be looking out for. But if they don't want to hold on to the f4 square, then we're just going to take with our bishop. That's completely fine. But if they try to maintain it, which they should try, maybe queen to g5, then we can just develop more material. Knight to c3. Maybe they play knight to c6, developing. But now we can play knight e2. This does 2 things. One, it still defends this square on d4, which is under attack. But now it also attacks the bishop on g3. Remember, they blew up our king side of the board. Anytime that h-pawn goes away, the king is pretty vulnerable on the king side. Now, we can castle on the queen side if we ever wanted to. More than likely, we're just going to stay in the center of the board. But you can see, once we start to blow up, attack this bishop, they really don't have a strong attack that they can do much else with. So that's what's going to happen if they play bishop to e7 early on. More than likely, they're going to be coming to h4, and that's how you should respond against that. So if we come back, the next variation we're going to be looking at is instead of d6, if they play the move h5. Now, hopefully you're following along with the theme of if our knight's not under attack on e5, we're going to be playing bishop c4. Bishop and knight both attacking the pawn on f7. Now they need to hold down this pawn. On the previous variation when we looked at this position, the knight was actually here on f6. So the best move, and really the only good square that black has to go to, is knight to h6. This is developing the knight, although not the greatest square, but it is defending this square here on f7. They don't just want to play d5, then we just take with our bishop. We still have the same threat, but then we just got a free pawn here. So the best move for them is knight to h6. In this case, we're going to be playing pawn to d4. Opening up, defending this e5 knight. We have 2 central pawns. We're also opening up for the dark square bishop to come to f4. So in this spot, if we look at it, okay, where would they go from there? The first one is, let's say bishop to e7. Now, we earlier looked at the threat of the bishop coming to e7, how dangerous that was because the queen and the bishop on e7 both attacking on h4. But now we can still just take on f4. And if they take with their bishop, before we were kind of stuck. We had to bring our knight to f2, but now we can play g3 because the bishop on f4 is protecting it. So we're not really worried about bishop to e7. That would be a pretty bad move. Now the other option is d6. So delaying the d6 move till after they play h5 and knight to h6 here opens up for the light square bishop to get involved into the game. And now it's attacking the knights. And the knights, usually when it's attacked by d6, it comes back to g4. It can't do that now because that's being protected by the pawn and the knight. So this knight does need to come back to d3. But this is a tough spot. The knight and the bishop are attacking this pawn on f4. This bishop on c4 is still attacking this f7 square. that is, yes, defended by the knight, but you don't just want to leave your knight on h6 the entire time. So finding the best way for black to continue is difficult. You know, if you try to just push forward on f3, okay, well, you could just take here. And take, I think, is extremely bad because now you take with your queen on f3. And now you're attacking with your queen and your bishop. And now you're really putting a lot of pressure on your opponent to just stay here with knight on h6. But if instead, if they don't take, well, what if they just play bishop to e7? But now we can just, again, take on bishop at f4. And we've completely controlled the center of the board. And now it's even easier if we want to castle on the queen side. And now how does black really continue? I think this is a good spot for white. The last variation we're going to look at is if they play bishop to g7. Now, reminder, if they're not attacking our knight, we're playing bishop to c4. If they are attacking our knight, we need to figure out how we're going to respond. Now, we have a couple options. We can go ahead and take on g4, but I like the approach of playing d4. d4 allows us to control the center of the board. We're not under any immediate threat right now, especially not from a pawn. If they attack us with a pawn, we obviously have to move, but pawn to d4 opens up. We can now play bishop takes on f4. We can get our light square bishop involved into the game. So I think this is the best approach. Now, if they play d6, we have to look at things a little bit differently. Before, we could always play knight takes on g4, which we're still going to do here. But they really wouldn't capture with their bishop because then we would just take their bishop. And that's not really the best exchange because typically this tends to be an open board state, meaning there's usually not a lot of pawns in the center of the board towards the endgame. And bishops are better than knights in that position just because they can control more of the board. But in this position, it's a little bit different because once the queen comes to g4, then black can actually take the pawn on d4. So it is slightly different in the exchange on why they may actually decide to go ahead and take with their bishop on g4. But that's completely okay because now we can just take their pawn on f4. And then both sides are equal in material. Both sides have 6 pawns. Neither side is feeling great about their position, but white does have the bishop pair. And I think going to the endgame, they have a better setup. Maybe they play knight to c6, getting material involved into the game. We can do the same. Now, if they want to exchange, I think that's fine. Yes, we have the double pawns on the c file, which is not great for us, but now they have no bishops. We have the bishop pair. I think going to the endgame, this would be good for us. I don't necessarily see them giving up their only bishop, but they definitely could. If they don't, that's fine as well. We can get our star square bishop involved into the game. We could even castle on the queen side depending on how they continue. But all in all, this is how I would approach it. So those are the 4 most common variations that you will run into. But thank you guys so much for watching the video. Thank you to our sponsor, Skillshare. Remember, link in the description below if you'd like to sign up for a free month. First 1,000 people to click on that and sign up will get a free month. Thanks again to them. If you have another video recommendation, please let me know in the comments below. I'll definitely be looking at those to see what you guys want to see in the future. But thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.